Hey everybody. So today we are going to talk about business ethics and social responsibility. And the way I like to describe it is this is kind of the how to lie, cheat, steal, cook the books, and commit other white-collar crimes lecture. The important components of this lecture, I'm going to tell three stories. One about Martha Stewart. We're going to talk about what crime she committed. We're also going to talk about Bernie Madoff, probably one of the biggest committers of a white-collar crime in the history of American business. And then the third story I'm going to tell you about is a Houston, Texas-based company called Enron. And Enron committed a massive white-collar crime that then became the basis of a ton of new legislation that really governs how companies need to stay honest, especially in the eyes of shareholders. By the way, we're going to talk about shareholders in the lecture being one of 5 different stakeholders within any organization of a company. We'll talk about what a stakeholder, or what it means to be a stakeholder. So let's get into it. Business ethics and social responsibility. So the first thing I want to talk about, and I'll try to get out of the way of the presentation a little bit so you can get a clear view. Also, as a reminder, my PowerPoint presentations are on Jupyter. They're uploaded, so if it's easier for you to follow along, listen to my voice, but if you want to look at your own PowerPoint slides, that's cool too. I will also link for you videos that I'm showing during this presentation, so if you want to watch the video kind of full screen, you can do that as well. I want to start the lecture by talking about the difference between ethics, universal ethics, and business ethics. So let's just start with the idea of ethics. And ethics is a very simple concept. It is things that are right, things that are good, things that in your gut instinct feel like they should be. I think we can all agree that taking of another human life, murder, is wrong. We don't need the law to explain this to us. We don't need religion to tell us this. We know that life is precious and the taking of a human life is wrong. So that's ethics. So if something is ethical, it is good, it is right. If something is unethical, it's bad, it's wrong, okay? Regardless of what the law says. And we'll get to that topic, the law, on my next slide. Now, universal ethics are things that we all understand. Universal ethics are taught in school, they're taught by religious institutions. Sometimes the law gives us a glimpse into what a universal ethical standard is, sometimes the Supreme Court, but these are things that, should be generally common sense. Ideas like treating people fairly, those are universal ethics. Business ethics are things that you don't know are right or wrong until really a corporation teaches them to you, maybe a business school teaches it to you, things like insider trading. So usually when I give a lecture on insider trading, most students have not heard of insider trading, don't really understand what it means. And then after I explain what insider trading is, I always have a couple of students who still say, Mr. Conti, I still don't understand why it's wrong. And let's see if you're in that same category when I explain Martha Stewart's crime, which is an example of insider trading. But business ethics are things that we need to be taught that certain applications are wrong, they're bad, because maybe they give an unfair advantage to somebody in a business setting. But they're not common sense universal standards that people learn as children, right? Like you shouldn't steal your friend's lunch. That's a universal ethics. Don't commit insider trading. That's more of a business ethic that we'll talk about, okay? And then my images here, we talk about things like sexual harassment and bribery and lying and maybe the theft of intellectual property, the theft of trade secrets. Those are examples of unethical behaviors that we're hearing a lot about in the media. We hear a lot of individuals who are committing crimes like sexual harassment in the workplace, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about in this lecture. Okay, so I'm going to get to the slide, and I'm going to step away from it so you can kind of get a sense of what the slide is talking about. And I'm going to say this, I'm going to make this statement. Just because something is unethical does not automatically mean it is illegal. And just because something is legal doesn't automatically make it ethical. Okay, what the heck does this mean? So if you look on this chart, there are 4 quadrants to this presentation. And let me explain to you probably the most obvious on this chart, which is legal and ethical. Okay, so these are things that the law says, yes, good, but also in your gut, ethically, you believe these are good, they're right. Okay, things like treating employees fairly. So the law says you must treat employees fairly. You cannot discriminate on the basis of age or gender or race, right? We're going to look at all types of laws in our human resources lecture in a different week. That will make this very clear. The law says we must treat employees fairly, and there are consequences for not doing that. But it also should feel right in your gut, right? Like when you hire somebody, the only person you should hire is the person who is the most qualified, and that should not be on the basis of their age or their gender or their race or their veteran status, let's say. So this is easy to understand. Legal and ethical. The law says yes, your gut says yes, okay? The other one that's easy to understand is illegal and unethical. Embezzling money is an example. So embezzling money is illegal. We're going to learn that Bernie Madoff, who got 2 life sentences as a result of embezzling money, found out quickly that that was illegal, but it's also unethical, right? In your gut instinct, you know that stealing money from another individual or stealing money from any type of entity, Bernie Madoff, as an example, stole money from the Holocaust Survivors Fund, of all places. That is both illegal and in your gut, it should feel wrong, okay? So these 2 quadrants are easy to understand, right? The law dictates what in our guts feels congruent. The other 2 quadrants are where I make the point that just because something is legal doesn't mean it's ethical, and just because something is illegal doesn't make it unethical. So let's look at legal. The law says yes, but unethical. So here's one example that I think for those of you studying fashion design and fashion merchandising should hit home, but for all of us, because we all wear clothing, so much of the clothing that we wear is produced in developing countries that have really poor standards of work environments, right? So we've seen plenty of documentaries about sweatshops and facilities where suicide rates are high, and just the general cleanliness factor, and things like the environment and exhaust is horrific, right? And we pay these workers in these factories, barely living wages. Does it feel wrong? Well, I guess we could debate. And some of you will say, yes, it feels horrible. It's taking advantage of people. It's enriching, American corporations at the detriment of, local peoples. And then others of you may say, well, it's just, it's the standard of living in that country, and that's what that country's wages are. So we can debate that. But the law says no issue with it, right? There is no law that says that American companies cannot produce their goods in sweatshops, or then many of these countries don't really have laws dictating the quality of life or the quality of the work environment the way in the United States we have laws like OSHA, right? The Occupational Safety and Health Act. So there's an example of something that it's legal, the law says no problem, but in your gut, do you feel like it's right? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, now I'll give you one example of illegal and ethical. So these are things that the law says no, can't do it, but in your gut, do you have an issue with it? One of it is the idea of pricing. So there's a law called the Robinson-Patman Act, and not to get into it, but the law says that there cannot be price discrimination. So basically, everybody needs to be charged the same thing, generally speaking, for goods and services, unless they're buying more, or there's some type of volume discount, something like that. That's called price discrimination, okay? Price fairness. And one example the textbook talks about is how about medical providers who want to provide, pricing for things on a sliding scale based on need, so that some people can, pay less because they're part of a low-income community, and others have to pay more because they can afford to pay more. So technically the law says that that's against the Robinson-Patman Act. It's price discrimination. But in your gut of guts, is there anything wrong with it? Is it unethical? And we can debate that as well. So I'm going to say it one more time. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's ethical. And just because something is illegal doesn't mean it's necessarily unethical. Okay? Okay, so here we go. My first story of the lecture. So you guys all know Martha Stewart, of course, right? Martha Stewart, she is one of America's most famous homemakers, cooks, never really a trained chef, but we're not really here to talk about Martha Stewart baking or cooking. We're here to talk about Martha Stewart as an individual who, with some of her wealth, chooses to invest her money, her personal money, not the corporation's money, but her money, in the stock market, okay? And so if you don't know, in order to invest money in the stock market, some people use a full service brokerage where you have a broker. And this guy right here is Peter Bukanovic, and this was Martha Stewart's stockbroker, okay? So Martha Stewart one day got wind of a stock from a company called ImClone. And ImClone is the maker of certain pharmaceuticals, including cancer drugs. And this guy here is Sam Woxel. Sam Woxel is the CEO of this company called ImClone. And he and Martha Stewart are friends. One day, Sam Woxel tipped off Martha Stewart that there was a new drug from ImClone coming to the market, and it was going to effectively treat and maybe partially cure a certain type of cancer. So, like any individual, if you hear that a company is coming out with a drug that's going to be effective at treating a certain kind of cancer, if you have the money, you're probably going to be interested in investing, just like Martha Stewart was. And so she called her stock brokerage and instructed Peter Bukanovic to buy a whole bunch of shares of this company, ImClone. Okay, technically crime was already committed, but I need to explain to you the rest of the story before you can understand what the crime is. Sometime later, Sam Woxel called his friend Martha back and said, "Oh my God, Martha, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, did not approve the did not approve the drug. And so you probably are gonna want to sell your stock before the public finds out about this FDA failure, and the value of the company's stock is going to go down, it's gonna plummet." And so Martha called back her stockbrokers and eventually sold her shares of stock. Okay, so therein a crime has been committed. What's the crime? The crime is called insider trading. And insider trading is basically using internal information that comes from within a publicly traded company for your own gain. Martha Stewart got information about her stock, about the investment that she made from inside the company. She got information that the general public, maybe holding shares of ImClone stock, would never have access to because they don't have a direct contact inside the company. So in a way, if you think back to our lecture on free market trade, this is kind of something that hurts free market trade. But in this example, we're talking about the stock market. If only some people are allowed to have access to information inside a company, but others are not, then it's not a fair playing game, right? You have some investors that have information that others don't. So some people can make smarter investment trades, buying and selling of shares of stock, and others can't. So a lot of students ask me, well, how was she caught? How did they find out? It was really simple, honestly. It came back to tracing cell phone records that could connect Martha with making the trade based on communication with the company's CEO and then with her stockbrokers. There were multiple involved, okay? That is what insider trading is. It is using internal information for your own gain. Before I show you a video, I want to just give you another example. I worked for a publicly traded company, Ralph Lauren. You guys know that I worked there for several years. And as an employee of Ralph Lauren, we were allowed to buy and sell shares of Ralph Lauren stock. We were a publicly traded company. I remember being there when the value of the stock hit $100, which was a really big deal for the company. But there were 4 times a year where we as employees were not allowed to buy or sell shares of stock. And these periods were called blackout periods. Periods where literally you were not able to buy more shares or sell shares of the stock that you owned. So think about it. What kind of company is Ralph Lauren, and what would happen during 4 specific times of the year? So Ralph Lauren is a retailer and a wholesaler. And the 4 times a year that I'm talking about are markets, right? So you've got spring, summer, fall, and winter markets. So as an employee internally, I know whether the company made 10 million or 100 million or $1 billion on a market, and any other public investor is not going to have access to that information until the company makes that information public. So how unfair would it be if employees were allowed to buy and sell shares of stock with information that they had, and the public has to just take a guess and believe in the public records that a publicly traded company, financial records that they're issuing? That's what insider trading is. It seeks to level the playing field so that investors can feel confident that they're not up against inside traders, okay? I'm gonna show you guys a video now, and you can feel free to pause this video and link to it in the links that I provided if you would rather watch the video on your own. And by the way, here's a picture, not really, of Martha decorating her jail cell. And yes, she was sentenced to a short period of time in a low security prison as the result of her crimes. And that is totally photoshopped. It is not a real Martha Stewart living magazine. Okay, here's the video.
Good things are a signature of Martha Stewart living. They're those simple, clever shortcuts and solutions that make everyday living just a little easier.
Known as the most famous homemaker in America, Martha Stewart transformed entertainment in the home into a worldwide media empire. With a daily TV show, her own product line, and countless publications, Stewart became a billionaire when her company went public in 1999. 2 years later, Stewart's star lost some of its shine when she was accused of insider trading.
In New York today, Martha Stewart was indicted on criminal charges relating to an insider trading scandal that began more than a year ago.
Well, if she's convicted of all these charges, she faces up to 30 years in prison and $2 million in fine.
During the investigation, the following story emerged. Martha Stewart's close friend, Sam Waxel, was CEO of Inclone, a biotech company that produced anti-cancer drugs. When Waxel learned that the Food and Drug Administration was about to reject Inclone's cancer drug, Erbitux, he called his stockbroker, Peter Bukanovic. Bukanovic was on vacation, so Waxel spoke instead to his assistant, Doug Faneuil, and instructed him to sell Waxel's Inclone stock. Faneuil contacted Bukanovic and explained the situation. Bukanovic, who was also Martha Stewart's broker, told Faneuil to call Stewart and tell her that Inclone's share price was likely to drop because Waxel was cashing out. Faneuil did so, and Stewart sold all her Inclone shares 1 day before the announcement of the FDA's rejection. As expected, when the news became public, Inclone shares declined sharply. Had Stewart not sold, she would have lost almost $46,000. These losses were now distributed among the people who bought the shares that Stewart sold to a market ignorant of the FDA's upcoming decision. Were Martha Stewart's actions ethically wrong? You be the judge.
Okay, so obviously we talked about the crime of insider trading. And so yes, her actions were wrong because in a way it dupes the fairness of the stock market, right? Where you have investors, an unfair situation where you have some investors who have access to inside information that the rest of public investors do not have, and that's unfair, okay? So that is both illegal and unethical. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is like, where do people learn ethics? And I mentioned some of the answers to this already, and that is that, ethics are hopefully deeply ingrained in a culture. You don't necessarily need religion or a school to tell you that you shouldn't hurt or kill other people, right? It's just sort of part of societal norms. And we learn these types of things very early on. Ethics can be learned in the household, from family, and then later on in educational institutions. And then ultimately we learn ethics, and especially business ethics, we learn them from our employers, right? Our employers are tasked with the idea of instructing people on things like not committing sexual harassment or not committing insider trading as an employee of a publicly traded company that allows you to buy and sell shares of the company's stock. Okay, so ultimately that falls on the company as a responsibility to ensure that its employees understand the difference between, things that are both illegal and also unethical. Okay. The other way that a company kind of covers its butt, CYA file, if you will, cover your ass, right, is the publishing of these statements that say, we do not lie, cheat, steal, cook the books, discriminate against people, we don't commit white-collar crimes, we don't do other unethical or illegal things. And those statements sometimes often are published in employee handbooks. They may also be published on companies' websites. So it gives employees access to that type of information so companies can be sure that they have trained and informed employees as to what ethical and illegal things will not be tolerated, okay? One other thing I want to talk about is the idea of the protection of whistleblowers. So what is a whistleblower? That's going to be a theme we hear of in our Enron story later on in this lecture. So a whistleblower is somebody who sees something illegal, unethical happening inside a company. And partly they don't want to be liable or responsible for it, and partly they want it to be remedied. So they escalate it, they tell, right? They report. It could be theft, it could be illegal accounting procedures, it could be sexual harassment, it could be a number of different illegal and unethical things happening. And the idea is that we not only want to protect whistleblowers, right? We want them to feel like you're not going to lose your job for letting senior management know that you've seen something and therefore you're saying something. But we almost want to create an environment of encouraging the whistleblower. I used to work for a company, Federated Department Stores, that had an anonymous hotline. And if you reported something like, one big thing in a buying office was we were not allowed to accept expensive gifts because it was considered bribery. And there was a limit to the value that we could accept a gift for. I think it was like $75 or $100, and this was 1,000 years ago. And so you could report if there was another buyer or assistant buyer accepting gifts, that were sizable gifts, you could report them. And if the information that you were giving was accurate, you would be financially rewarded. Or in another case, if you worked in a retail store, if you reported employee theft, you would get financially rewarded. So that is a really important theme in this instruction of ethics as far as companies go, is not just to protect whistleblowers, but to encourage them and to give them a platform, because ultimately they are helping the company, right? Senior management cannot be always with their eyes and ears on the ground, and a lot of the time you rely on middle management and lower level management to be whistleblowers and to report illegal and unethical things that they see. Okay, so there's that whistleblower. We talked about the idea of written code of ethics, be it in an employee manual, be it on a website, all that good stuff. Okay, second of three big stories with this lecture is Bernie Madoff. I will not make the joke of he made off with the money, because there's nobody here to laugh at my jokes. But Bernie Madoff was probably the biggest white-collar criminal in the history of American white-collar crime. He embezzled, and honestly, I can't tell you the number. I've read as high as 75 billion. The video will say 20-something billion. Whatever it was the largest swindle in history. And he operated a Ponzi scheme. And so let me explain to you what a Ponzi scheme is. And it's a really simple and low-tech crime. So a Ponzi scheme is this. If I had a room full of people, I would say, How many of you would invest with me $10 if I promised you $20 in return? Some of you would be skeptical, and some of you would say, Mr. Conti, I'm in. Okay, so as I begin to amass money from my investors, $10 here, and $10 there, and $10 here, and I have some people who want to cash out of my investment, and I say it with quotes. Let's say I make good on some of my investors and I actually return them this 50% return on investment. You've given me 10, I'm giving you 20 back. And so all of a sudden these happy investors go and tell a whole bunch of people, oh my God, this investment house, this John Conti investment brokerage is producing a 50% return on investment. You can't do that in any bank, you can't do that in the stock market, period, right? Not even in the best year. Meanwhile, what I'm doing with that money is instead of actually making investments, investing in funds, let's say, I'm embezzling it, which is just a fancy word for I'm stealing the money, okay? And on paper, I may produce phony records like your bank record that tells you how much money you have in that account, but really the money is not there, the money is being embezzled, okay? Bernie Madoff amassed something like $75 billion worth of investments from individual people, from wealthy people. Kevin Bacon, the actor, put basically his whole entire life savings into this Madoff funds. He had the pension, the teacher's pension of the Teachers Union of Florida. So you're talking about retirees, would-be retirees all across the state of Florida putting billions of dollars into this fund. I mentioned earlier in the lecture the Holocaust Survivors Fund. You may remember in high school reading the book Night by Elie Wiesel. So that book was written by a Holocaust survivor. He went on to become a New York Times bestseller, obviously a multimillionaire. He started the Holocaust Survivors Fund, and all of that money got caught up in this Ponzi scheme, this giant embezzlement, this crime. And it took literally 30 years for this crime to kind of wash out. I mean, Bernie Madoff had been perpetuating this Ponzi scheme far longer than Charles Ponzi, the original committer of a Ponzi scheme. I think his scheme lasted weeks, let alone decades. And at the end of the day, the way it crumbled was very simple. 2008 happened. We've talked a lot in this class about the economic kind of collapse, sort of short-term, almost recession of 2007, 8, 9. And a lot of investors got scared. And on paper, even though the stock market was crumbling, Madoff's company never posted a loss. There was never any type of loss on investments. But investors got scared, and too many people wanted to pull out of the investment, and the money just wasn't there. And it didn't take long for the FBI to figure out that what this was a giant Ponzi scheme. Okay, I'm going to show you a clip on the Madoff Ponzi scheme. There are entire movies, Hollywood dramatizations, and documentaries on Madoff and his sons. There's a long story there. Were they involved or not? One committed suicide after Madoff went to jail, and it's a really, really interesting business story. But let's take a look at this quick clip from this resource that I really like.
The fraud Bernie Madoff was operating collected billions from unsuspecting clients, victims who believed they were getting steady returns with very little risk. In reality, they weren't getting any returns at all. All Madoff was doing was giving investors their own money back. It's called the Ponzi scheme, after Charles Ponzi, who became notorious for using the technique in early 1920. And it's one of the simplest cons there is. In a Ponzi scheme, the grifter persuades his marks, or victims, to part with their money by claiming he has a wonderful new investment strategy producing a great rate of interest. In fact, the con man isn't paying interest at all. He's just slowly giving his victims some of their own money back and living the high life with the rest. More and more money comes in as new generations of victims hear about the apparently high returns. And that's just as well, as the scheme will collapse if it runs out of cash. And sooner or later, that's bound to happen with every Ponzi scheme. The supply of money and marks always dries up in the end. Bernie had a good thing going when in the fall of 2008, the economy collapsed and too many of his marks started asking for their money back. And that, Ponzi expert James Walsh says, was the beginning of the end.
The main reason that Madoff's scheme ultimately collapsed is the reason that all Ponzi schemes ultimately collapse. It simply became too big to perpetuate, to keep going. Now, Madoff, because of his position, because of his skills, got a lot larger and lasted a lot longer than most Ponzi perpetrators do. But at the end of the day, it was the same thing. He couldn't find enough cash fast enough to cover his obligations.
How much cash, you ask? Well, early estimates were upwards of $64 billion. But those claims were based on the illusionary profits Madoff reported to his victims. In reality, an investigation by a court-appointed trustee calculated real losses to be a mere $21 billion.
Now, this is still a lot of money, a huge amount of money, and will make his swindle the largest in U.S. history by a long stretch.
Okay, so before we go on to talk about the third kind of big white-collar crime that I want to tell you a story about in this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about who stakeholders are. So when a company commits a crime, when a company does something unethical, illegal, it has the potential to affect 5 different groups of people. We call those people stakeholders. So when you have a stake in something, you have an interest in it, right? It affects you somehow. I always use the example of Wade College. So for you all, you are customers of Wade College. You have a stake in Wade College being good, doing good things, doing good legal things. I'm an employee of Wade College. I also have a stake in Wade College. I am impacted by Wade College doing good, ethical, honest things, okay? So here is any organization. A stakeholder is anybody that has a stake in the company's performance, anybody that's impacted by that organization's good or bad deeds. And so make sure you know these 5 groups, okay? So obviously employees, right? We think about companies like Google that have really great reputations for treating employees really well. We think about like the stereotypical Google corporate environment that, you know, serves lunch and takes care of your dry cleaning and has doctors on staff and, you know, has all types of recreational things so the employees are happy and healthy and want to be at work. So that's that. Customers, obviously customers impacted, especially when companies market bad products, faulty products, products that hurt or kill people. Customers can be influenced and affected by that. Then there are suppliers. Suppliers are, or companies are the customers of suppliers. And when a supplier, you know, depends on a company's business and that company maybe jeopardizes its own business. We're going to learn about Enron. Enron literally within a matter of 20-something days went out of business because of unethical behavior. That affects how many different suppliers that depended on Enron to sell goods and services to, right? Suppliers of Wade College would be things like the companies we buy our textbooks from and our furniture from, and the Infomart. The Infomart's probably our biggest supplier because they're our landlord and they depend on our rent in part to operate. So those are suppliers. Investors are obviously either the individuals or the companies that are investing in an organization with the intent that that organization is going to grow and provide some return on investment. When companies do things that jeopardize their existence, when a company commits a crime, when a company is embattled in scandal, you know, that obviously directly impacts investors in a financial way. right? The value of their investment goes down. And then finally, I like to tell the story of Erin Brockovich as an example of how local communities are affected by the behavior of an organization. So if you don't know the movie Erin Brockovich, which, by the way, the real Erin Brockovich, not Julia Roberts, but the real Erin Brockovich is a graduate of Wade College. She graduated, I believe, in 1980, and she did the merchandising program here. But that's kind of a confusing point because in the movie, they kind of portray Erin Brockovich as a sort of paralegal, legal assistant. She never went to law school, she's not an attorney, but she did in fact pursue a career having to do with legal cases. So what's the movie about? The movie is about Erin Brockovich finding a job in this law firm where she works on defending people that lived in a local community that was being poisoned by runoff and waste, and the water was getting poisoned by certain companies in a community. It's a great example of how the illegal and unethical actions of organizations can really, in this case, hurt and kill, cause cancer and everything else to people in local communities, okay? Now, conversely, by the way, there are lots of great examples of the way organizations, corporations, benefit people in local communities, right? I think of Dallas, so many of the different bridges and parks and infrastructure that we enjoy, the beautification of our city, the theaters that we have, much of our arts district, all of that stuff is sponsored by corporations in Dallas. So actually, in some ways, our lives here in this city are improved by the generosity of corporations, and they use the wealth that they're creating to actually give back to the community. So it can certainly go both ways. Make sure that you understand for our exam who stakeholders are, okay? 5 groups of stakeholders: employees, customers, suppliers, investors,